Hey guys, Jeffrey from Headstrong Training Systems here. So today I want to talk about the conventional deadlift and how to find your ideal stance width or foot placement that works best for you. Now, when I talk about stance placement, simply what I'm referring to is how wide apart your feet should be when you want to perform the conventional deadlift. Now, we're not talking about the sumo deadlift, we'll visit that on another occasion. But right now, I want to talk about how wide you should set your feet for the conventional deadlift. Now let's break down the three positions. First of all, you have very narrow. You've got a very narrow stance. Secondly, you might have a more medium stance or shoulder width stance, and then you might have a wider stance. Now let's break down those three different types of stances in each of those positions. Firstly, the very narrow stance. In this stance, you might be slightly thinner or closer in relation to your shoulders. So say my hands here, this is where I grip, this would be my shoulders, shoulder width. My stance is relatively closer into that. In this type of stance, you'll see that lifters, they're able to be a lot more explosive. They're able to be a lot more explosive because the force transfer from your feet into the ground is much closer together, and as such, often these lifters, they're able to generate a lot more force off the ground. Now, on the flip side, the problem with this is you're often compromising you're often compromising stability for raw power. So because of this position, you'll see that lifters sometimes they lose their balance at lockout, or during the movement they might shift forward or back simply because they've got too much explosiveness, too much power, and not enough of a stable base of support. So that's something for you to play around with. Secondly, you have your medium stance, or as saying about shoulder width apart. So this is the stance that most people would go to, and what I would advocate to use if you're in a position where you're not sure which stance you're most comfortable with. Say in this stance, everything is pretty standard. Your feet placement is relatively shoulder width apart. You have enough force transfer into the ground, and you still have a solid base of support. So I would say that stance, or that shoulder width stance, I would argue that it's probably the average, the normal, where you have stability and you have power. It's very stable. Now, the third stance that I want to go into is a wider stance. Now, a wider stance, you'll see that with here, my arms are forced outwards. That's one of the problems with a wider stance straight away. When my arms are forced outwards and they're not traveling straight down because my knees have pushed them out, you're edging into a snatch grip deadlift. My range of motion will be increased because my arms have been shortened. But on the vice versa, the people that would go into this stance, I would say these are maybe heavier athletes, maybe a middle to heavyweight class, where they don't have the mobility to have their foot placement very close in. So probably like strongman, you see like Brian Shaw, his conventional deadlift, his foot stance is quite wide, is much wider than the normal stance, but I would say that's simply because his body doesn't have the mobility, or is unable to get into that position. So that wider stance, I don't see often, and I probably wouldn't recommend it for your average athlete. So when looking to decide your ideal foot placement for the conventional deadlift, you want to consider, or the most important variable to consider is, in what position are you able to generate the most amount of power off the ground whilst remaining stable and not losing your position. Now, what I've tried around and what I've been taught, or what I've heard, is that a very good way to figure out this stance is to do a run up and to do a run up box jump, because the foot placement or the stance that you perform your takeoff with is naturally your body's strongest position at generating force momentum off the floor without losing stability. So I would recommend trying that out. If you're a newer lifter who's trying to find your ideal stance, I would recommend doing a run-up box jump, and then at that point where you take off and you break the floor, take note of the stance that you're fit in, how wide apart they are, and that would be a very good starting point to begin with, and then play around from there. It's always about finding what works for you and what's most comfortable for you. So to recap or summarize what we've gone over today, we looked at three types of stances for the conventional deadlift: a very narrow stance, quite a normal stance, and a wider stance. with your foot placement. Really, it's up to you to find out what your personal preference and works best for you. I've listed for each of them the general pros and cons of them. But yeah, so if anything, hopefully that was helpful for you guys. Any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Until then, I'll catch you guys next time.